Hello and welcome back to the Django ORM series. This is part 2. So if you were expecting to find a simple tutorial where someone quickly shows you how to perform an OR query, this tutorial is slightly different. It's going to be a little bit more long-winded and drawn out in that I'm going to show you simple OR queries, and then in addition to that, queue objects utilizing or running OR queries. And then while we're doing that, I want to show you some other things. For example, how to view the query SQL and start reading it, and then potentially look at query performance. If you are someone who just wants to quickly find out how to perform an OR query, then have a look in the timeline below, and I should have pointed it out where the actual code is and maybe the description of the actual code. As per normal, the actual code utilized in this tutorial is in the link or the description below this video. So I've already gone ahead and set this up ready for us to demonstrate the queries. If you want to follow this code base, you'll find all the code up until where we are now, all the setup in this file here called task1setup.zip. So all you need to do is extract that into a folder, run a virtual environment if you want to, and then you'll be ready to start as I am here. So this is just a simple setup where we have two apps, a core and a student. So the core is the main app with the settings. We've gone ahead and created a new app here called students. We have a model. So I've created two tables, one called teacher and one called student. Just like I said, a bit of setup here. And at the moment we don't have any data, so I'll do that as we go along. And then that's about it really. Apart from the URLs, so I've connected the URLs. There we go. And then we also have in students a template where we just output some data. So I'm using a tool here called SQLite in the Visual Studio Code library. So I've gone ahead and downloaded that extension, And now when I go back into my application and select and right click the the database, I can now open the database and it will appear at the bottom here, and I can view inside, so I can go and drill down into, I've added some data now into the student, for example, so I can right click and show table. And right hand side here, you can see all the data in the table. So you can skip this if you want to, or if you're already familiar with this, but I'm just going to quickly show you how to use both the commands here in this function and also the shell to output data to the screen or in the console, for example. So in this series, we're going to be working from the terminal, and we're going to output sometimes to the template that we've called output here. So it just shows you both ways of outputting data to the screen, just allows you to see what data is actually being outputted. So I've hooked up this view with our model. This is our model student. So we're going to be working on there. So first of all, let's just do a post equals student. So that's the name of the table that we're importing. And then we're just going to select the object manager, which is called object. And then so we're just going to display all the data from the database. So we're going to output that. So I just want to show you a few different methods here. Let me just drop this down. So what we can do is we can utilize print. So print allows us to print to the terminal. And what we want to print to the terminal is the posts. So all the data that's inside of this post. So we collected all the data from the database, we put it into this variable, and now we're just going to print it out to the terminal. So we're going to need some way of actually running this function. So this function here, if I just drop all this down, this function here is connected. Let me just drop all this. This function is connected here to my URLs. So I have a URL here that's going to run that function. So you can see that that is running the default path of, or nothing, the root directory. Now, if we run this back to the core in the URLs, you can see that I'm utilizing this file path name here called student/. So I need to type that into the browser in order then to run this function. So the server is turned on. So let's head over to the browser. Well, at least I say let's head over to the browser, but of course it's not going to work, is it? Because we need some sort of return. So let's return render and then the request. And we're going to utilize the output.html template. And then we want to output in some data we will do eventually anyway, so we might as well just set this up. So we're going to say, we're going to pass over the data as post, or reference to it as post, and then the data we're going to send across is the post data. Just call that post as well. So this is the reference that we're going to send over to this template, and this is the actual data that's being returned from the database. Okay, so that should be okay. Let's go ahead over to the browser and just refresh. Okay, so you can see that we've actually returned some data, 3 items. Now there is 3 items in the database, so that's what we were expecting. Now, interestingly, if we go back into our code editor here, you can see that in the terminal, we've actually also outputted the objects that are returned from the database. So now we can go one step further. Let's type in print, but this time we're going to return the query. So we're going to type in query here. And what this is going to happen is it's going to show us the actual SQL code that's being run to actually run this query. So let's go back into our browser and refresh. And then let's go back into our terminal here. And you can now see we have some SQL. So this here represents SQL. So if you're wondering what SQL is, Structured Query Language, it's the language utilized by databases. So here what's happening, generally speaking, what's happening here is that we're running this query here. This is obviously in Python. So this was explained in the previous tutorial. So we run this query here, and this gets translated by the ORM into SQL. And then that gets then sent across to the database, which can then perform the operation. So the database cannot use Python. So this is why it gets translated into SQL, so the database can utilize it, run the query, and return the data. If we were to take a quick look at this, this is a select statement, an SQL select statement. So select and then the table. So we're going to select student table, and then from the table we're going to select the first name, the surname, the age, and the classroom and the teacher. So these are all of the different fields inside of our table. So if we go back into the student model, you can see that we've got first name, surname, age, classroom, teacher. So those are all the fields. What's happening is here, the SQL instruction is, the SQL instruction is collecting all that data because we've asked in our query here to select all. So select all the tables. So not tables, all the fields in this table, in the student table. So that's what it's doing here. And then, apologies, this is where it says from. So select, these are all the field names, sorry. That wasn't clear in the first time I said that. So from, and then this is the database. So select tables, or field, sorry, from this table. Simple as that. So throughout this series, we're going to be utilizing these 2 commands here just to have a look at the query and just to output the objects that are returned, just to have a look to see what's being returned. And this can be an easier way of looking at the data instead of having to go to the front end. Now, of course, you have seen that we've outputted the data. We're passing that data over as posts. So that's, if we go back into the output here, you can see that I've just outputted posts. So that's basically takes all the data that's returned from a database and just outputs it. I have got a little loop here that we're utilizing a different part of the tutorial series. So at the moment, we're just outputting the objects that get returned. So next up, we're going to also import connection. Okay, so from a DjangoDB, import connection. So let's just have a look at what this does. So what we can do is we can run this after we've performed a query. And this is going to give us some more information about the query that's just run. So here what we're going to do is run a print and then connection.queries. So let's just perform this action again by refreshing the page. And now what we have, if we look down here, we now have not only the SQL that is actually run, again it's repeated here, but we also have a little bit more information. So we have a limit, we have a time. So this is the execution time, the length of time it took to run this query. And you can see here it took 0.015. So I won't confess to utilizing this all the time, but I would assume this is seconds here. This is a tenths, hundreds, thousandths of a second. So this took roughly 0.015 of a second to execute. So that can be a pretty handy function when maybe you're playing around with SQL code, raw code, where you're trying to create performance enhancements. You can see how long a query is going to take and then check the performance of it. So you're probably asking at the moment, when am I going to show you the OR statements? I do apologize. There's just one more thing I want to show, and that's utilizing the shell. So it's a little bit of an inconvenience having to refresh this page every time just to run the query. So alternatively, you can use the terminal. So by all means, just go ahead and run the commands in the terminal. So if I open up a shell here, Python shell, I can then go ahead and actually, first of all, just select the tables that I want to use. So student.model. So in the student models, I want to import the student table. So I import the student table. Now, import name student from student model. So maybe I've just named these incorrectly. So it was called student. Yes. Okay, so from student. Now the app's called student. So from student.models import capital. I think that was where we went wrong last time. We didn't have a capital because the model is called student with a capital. It's a class. Okay, so now what we can do is to run the query again. So post equals student with a capital dot objects dot all. Okay, and now we can just run what we've collected in this variable post. So we run post, and you can now see we return the data. So for some, that's a little bit more of an inconvenient way of setting up your queries and testing them. And alternatively, you can utilize that if you want to, but I'll probably go ahead in this series and utilize the setup using the web page and utilizing the view here, because it just makes it a little bit easier for you to replicate. Sometimes in the terminal, you type these things out, and you have to type them out again and so on. And if you make mistakes and so on, it can be a little bit quicker ultimately when we're learning queries to run them in the function. So now, OR queries, OR queries. So OR, what is OR? So what we're trying to do here is build a query where we're saying we want to select everything from a database where the name equals X or Y. So it's kind of an optional query that we can run. So I'm just going to, I'm just going to blank this out. So we're not going to use this anymore. So I'm just going to put this underscore there. And we're going to run another function with the same name. So we can output it still. I'll just remove that. So we'll create a new function here. So let's just go ahead and create a very simple OR example. So let's go ahead and we'll create a variable post, save all the data, equals student.objects dot, and this time we're going to run a filter. So running a filter is going to allow us to create a simple OR. So first of all, we want to select what we want to make an OR statement about. So let's do an OR statement. Let's collect all the students' names which start with either or either. Let's open up our database. So this is handy to utilize. So we can see what data we've got. So let's build a query whereby we will extract data from a database where the student's surname equals Austin or Baldwin. So OR. So we'll just move that across here so we can utilize it in a second. So we're going to say here, surname dunder starts with. So we're going to use the starts with. We could use ends with, but obviously we want starts with equals. And then we're going to specify, what was the name? Austin. Okay, so that's obviously going to select all the information or all the students that begin with the surname, begins with Austin. Now, obviously, we want to create an OR statement. So now we need the vertical bar on the keyboard or pipe or whatever you call it. And I'm using wrapping here. Apologies. So we need OR, and then we now just need to define the OR. So the OR is going to be, we're just going to need to type in again student.objects dot, and then filter again. So we're just literally copying what we've already done. And now we're just going to have again the surname. And we're doing starts with, in this case, and then equals, and then whatever we've got. So let's go back into our database. So we're going to say Baldwin. So Baldwin. So this should run a query by which we will find any of the students that their surname begins with Austin or their surname starts with Baldwin. So we should return 2 items. So let's go ahead and just finish this off by copying this out. Now, of course, we don't need a post query and the connection queries because the connection.queries does also print out the SQL. So we won't need that. So this is what we've got. So we can just toggle that. I'll toggle that back. Okay, so you can now see what we end up with. So let's go ahead now and run this. So I'm just going to refresh this page. And obviously I need to make sure that it's actually turned on. So I'll just exit this, run the server. Okay, then I'll just do the refresh again. And you can see it's returned 2 items. So clearly that is working okay. So there we have a simple OR statement. Now, of course, we can keep buddying this up. So we could add another filter here and so on. So you can continue adding OR statements. That is not a problem. So let's have a look at the actual code here to see what the SQL does. So you can see what we return, these 2 items, these 2 objects, these 2 students. SQL then, so select, and then we've got all the items as per normal. Okay, then we say from, and then we define the table we want to collect the data from. And then this time we use a where. So this is a select from where statement, an SQL select from where statement. So where student surname is like Austin, or student surname is like Baldwin. Okay, so you can kind of see the syntax that's going on here. You can see that it took 0.000 seconds to complete, which is great. Obviously, this is a local machine, so I was surprised the first time that we actually saw any numbers apart from 000 there. So you can kind of start to read the SQL statement and what is happening here. So let's give you an example of using an OR statement, but this time using Q objects. So this probably isn't the time and place to start giving you information about what a Q object is, but all I'm going to say is this allows us to build more complex queries utilizing Q objects. So by all means have a little read, and I will cover this in a separate tutorial what Q objects are and so on, but we're going to just show you an example of utilizing Q objects. And like I said, it just allows us to ultimately create more complex queries later along the line when we're building more complex queries. Utilizing Q objects, the setup is pretty much the same. We're going to wrap everything around a queue. So we'll do that first, and we'll just add another right here. And then what we're going to do is these become individually encapsulated there. Okay, so we've got a queue, and then we can go ahead and after the OR, we can now add another queue right here. And then this then becomes, just read this. So we've got student.objects. So we don't need student.objects again. So we can remove student.objects. I'm thinking I should have just wrote this out the first time. So we don't need, this is the change. So we can get rid of the student.objects again. We only need to declare that one time in this case, or once. And this time we just need to go ahead and write out the surname starts with again equals, and then I think it was Baldwin. So go ahead and put that in. Okay, so let's just finish that off. I think that's it. So let's go ahead and run this query. So we return exactly the same results again. If we go down into the terminal, you can see pretty much exactly the same code here is being run. So we've got the OR, the likes. So it's pretty much exactly the same SQL code, but obviously this time we're using QObjects. So obviously if I wanted to extend this, I could do. If I just do this, for example. Now, for example, if I go into my data, let's just also select the last student surname. So if I go back into my view and then change the bold one to the new student, obviously what should happen now is I should output 3 students, and there we go. So we can keep adding to this OR as many times we like. So while we're looking at this, I've added the not here. So what we're saying here is that select all students where surname equals Austin, where the surname doesn't or not begin with Baldwin, and the surname starts with Avery Parker. So what should happen here when we utilize not is this won't get shown on screen. So it won't get selected. So if I refresh, there we go. So you can see that all we have is Shannon and Raquel, and Baldwin is no longer being shown because we said not. So this was a simple example of not and how you could utilize this to remove or not select an item from the database. Okay, so there we have it, simple OR queries. So we covered simple OR query, how to extend them so we can have infinite amount of ORs. And then we did the same thing with the QObjects, although I didn't explain QObjects in that much detail. It is something that you want to become familiar with. So by all means, first of all, just read the documentation, and I'll cover QObjects in this series, give you a little bit more detail. And then we've also given you some ideas of how to view the SQL query language that's being utilized to perform the queries. And the last thing that was demonstrated is showing you how to get some general information about the query performance.